September 19th, 1947. 11:47 p.m. Small's Paradise, 2294 7th Avenue. A.38 revolver pressed against Bumpy Johnson's temple. The hitman's finger tightened on the trigger. 32 witnesses sat frozen at their tables, drinks suspended mid-air. The band had stopped mid-note 3 minutes earlier. The stakes were simple. Bumpy's death meant $75,000 for the shooter and complete Italian control over Harlem's numbers racket, a $3 million annual operation. This wasn't just another mob execution. This was the moment that would determine whether Harlem remained black-owned or became another colony in Lucky Luciano's empire. The hitman leaned close, his breath reeking of whiskey and cheap cigars. "Any last words, Bumpy?" Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the most feared man in Harlem, looked up from his bourbon. He smiled. Then he spoke 3 words. What happened next would become the most whispered legend in organized crime history. The hitman's hand began to shake. 3 weeks earlier, Harlem was a powder keg wrapped in jazz music and desperation. Bumpy Johnson controlled 138th to 147th Street between Lenox and 8th Avenue. Not through fear alone, though fear certainly helped. Bumpy controlled Harlem because he fed families during the Depression, because he sent kids to college, because he kept Italian and Irish mobs from bleeding the neighborhood dry. At 42 years old, Head survived 23 attempts on his life, 14 stints in jail, and countless wars with rivals who underestimated the man with the bumpy head and the brilliant mind. What made Bumpy different wasn't his violence plenty of men could kill. It was his chess player brain in a game where everyone else played checkers. He could read a room, a rival, a situation 3 moves before anyone else saw the board. September 1947 was a dangerous time to be black and powerful. The war had ended 2 years earlier, and white crime syndicates wanted their investments back. The Mafia saw Harlem's numbers racket generating $3 million annually and wanted every cent. Frank Costello controlled the politicians. Meyer Lansky controlled the money. Lucky Luciano, even from his Italian exile, still controlled the muscle. They'd systematically taken over black-owned operations in Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia. Harlem was next. The Italian families had been patient, strategic, methodical. Now they were ready to strike. Bumpy Johnson stood alone as the last barrier between Harlem's economic independence and complete mafia domination. He controlled 42 numbers banks, employed 237 runners, and paid out winnings fairly unheard of in the rackets. If Bumpy fell, Harlem fell. Wall Street watched, City Hall watched, every crime family from New York to Miami watched. The question wasn't if they'd move against Bumpy. The question was when Vincent the Blade Carbone answered that question with a contract and a promise. Carbone was Costello's top enforcer, a Calabrian immigrant with 17 confirmed kills and a reputation for never missing. Head orchestrated the Castellano takeover in Brooklyn, the Morello massacre in the Bronx, and the bloody Queens Territory wars that left 23 men dead in 6 weeks. When Vincent Carbone received a contract, that contract became a death certificate. The Mafia paid him $5,000 per hit, but had taken this job for $75,000 because Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a target. Bumpy was the trophy that would cement Carbone's legend forever. Carbone wanted Harlem's numbers operation handed to the 5 families. Bumpy Johnson was the only obstacle preventing a clean transition of power. Remove Bumpy, and the 42 numbers banks would fold within a week. The runners would submit or disappear. The money would flow downtown to Costello's counting rooms on Mulberry Street. Simple economics, simple elimination. Vincent Carbone was dangerous because he never failed and never left witnesses. His last 3 hits had been conducted in crowded restaurants, and nobody saw anything. Not the waiters. Not the diners. Not even the victim's bodyguards, who somehow always looked away at precisely the wrong moment. Head killed men in church, in barber shops, in their own homes, surrounded by armed soldiers. Carbone had political protection from City Hall, financial backing from Meyer Lansky's offshore accounts, and the full resources of the 5 families behind him. His body count stood at 17. He wanted Bumpy to be 18 on August 28, 1947. Carbone sent word through intermediaries. Bumpy could leave Harlem voluntarily and live, or stay and die. The ultimatum came with a deadline, September 20th. Bumpy had 3 weeks to abandon everything Head built or face the blade's steel. Carbone's plan was elegant in its brutality and public in its execution. He would kill Bumpy Johnson in front of Harlem's elite at Small's Paradise, the crown jewel of black nightlife. Not in an alley, not in a private room. In the main club, surrounded by witnesses, during prime hours when the place was packed. The message would be unmistakable. Italian power was absolute, and nobody, not even Bumpy Johnson, could touch them. Carbone paid off the club's security, the doormen, and the beat cops outside. He positioned 2 backup shooters at the bar and another at the kitchen entrance. Every exit was covered, every contingency planned. Bumpy would die at his regular table, and everyone would see that resistance was futile. Small's Paradise glittered that September night like a jewel box filled with smoke and secrets. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across the mahogany bar where Ed Small himself poured drinks for Harlem's power players. The bandstand held 12 musicians in crisp tuxedos. Playing Duke Ellington's Mood Indigo for the 78 patrons would paid $5 cover to see and be seen. Red velvet booths lined the walls, and the air smelled of expensive perfume, bourbon, and cigarette smoke thick enough to taste. Bumpy sat at table 7, his usual spot near the back where he could watch both entrances. Across from him sat Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen herself, in a silver dress that caught the light. 2 tables over, Reverend Clayton Powell nursed a scotch and pretended not to notice the criminal royalty in his midst. At 11:38 p.m., Vincent Carbone entered through the main entrance on 7th Avenue. He wore a gray suit and a black fedora pulled low. The doorman nodded him through without checking for weapons. At 11:41 p.m., Carbone's 2 backup men took positions at the bar, ordering rye whiskey they wouldn't drink. The band played on. Conversation flowed. Nobody noticed the trap closing. At 11:44 p.m., Carbone began walking toward table 7. His right hand moved inside his jacket, fingers wrapping around cold steel. Bumpy saw him coming. Stephanie St. Clair's eyes widened. She started to speak. Bumpy raised one finger. She went silent. At 11:46 p.m., Carbone reached the table. The music stopped. Not because the band chose to stop, but because the trumpet player, James Sweet Williams, recognized death approaching, and his lips simply couldn't blow another note. Silence spread like spilled ink. 78 people turned to watch. Carbone drew his .38 revolver, nickel-plated and loaded with hollow-point bullets that would take off half of Bumpy's skull. He pressed the barrel against Bumpy's right temple. "Any last words, Bumpy?" The gun was cold. The room was silent. A woman at table 12, Clara Henderson, a seamstress from 142nd Street, would later say she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The bartender, Thomas Tommy Wright, dropped a glass. It shattered on the floor like breaking bones. Nobody moved to clean it. At table 4, a white journalist from the New York Post named Michael Richardson held his pen motionless above his notebook, frozen. Time stretched. Seconds became hours. The moment hung suspended like smoke in the air. Then Bumpy Johnson smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a desperate smile. A smile of absolute certainty. He looked up at Vincent Carbone with eyes that had seen death 1,000 times and remained unimpressed. He lifted his bourbon glass with his left hand, took a slow sip, and set it down with precise care. The glass made a soft click against the wooden table. That click echoed in the silence like a gunshot. Then Bumpy spoke 3 words. "Check your cylinder." The room held its breath. Even breathing seemed forbidden in that frozen moment. Vincent Carbone's smile faltered. What Vincent Carbone didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had owned this moment for 18 days. On September 1st, the day after Carbone's ultimatum deadline was delivered, Bumpy had done what he always did, had gathered information, not through violence, but through the network of bartenders, maids, shoeshine boys, and doormen who knew everything that mattered in New York. Within 48 hours, Bumpy knew Carbone's hotel, his routine, his backup plan, and the name of his gunsmith, a nervous Italian named Paolo Ricci, who operated out of a Bronx basement. On September 7th, Bumpy sent Junie Bird, his most trusted lieutenant, to visit Paolo Ricci with $10,000 cash and a simple proposition: modify Carbone's weapon or lose your fingers. Ricci took the money. On September 10th, when Carbone brought his, for a routine cleaning, Ricci loaded it with 6 specially prepared rounds bullets with the primers removed, rendered completely inert, looking perfect but utterly useless. Bumpy had known for 9 days that Vincent Carbone would walk into Small's Paradise carrying a gun that wouldn't fire. Had known Carbone would position backup shooters at the bar. So Bumpy had Francine Washington, who'd worked as a waitress at Small's for 6 years, serve those men drinks spiked with chloral hydrate at 11:30 p.m. Both shooters were unconscious in the bathroom by 11:43 p.m., slumped over toilets with their weapons still holstered. Had known Carbone would position a 3rd man at the kitchen entrance. So Bumpy had 4 men waiting in that kitchen with baseball bats and a clear message: stay quiet or leave in pieces. The 3rd shooter stayed very quiet. At table 7, Vincent Carbone's hand trembled as he pointed the gun away from Bumpy's head. He swung open the cylinder with practiced motion. His face went white. The 6 bullets sat in their chambers looking perfect, but Vincent Carbone had loaded and unloaded enough guns to know when something felt wrong. The weight was off, just slightly, just enough. He ejected 1 round into his palm and examined it under the chandelier light. No primer. He checked another. No primer. All 6 rounds were dead. Had been standing in Harlem's most famous nightclub, holding a gun to Bumpy Johnson's head, with a weapon that was nothing more than an expensive paperweight. Bumpy Johnson stood slowly, adjusting his cufflinks with casual precision. He looked at Vincent Carbone with the calm of a teacher addressing a disappointing student. "You came from my kingdom. But kings don't lose to men who can't see 3 moves ahead." He reached into his own jacket. The room tensed. Bumpy withdrew not a gun but a photograph. He placed it on the table facing Carbone. It showed Carbone's wife and 2 daughters outside their home in Bensonhurst, dated that morning. "I could have touched them. I could have touched you 100 times. I didn't, because I'm not interested in killing messengers." Bumpy stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent room. "You go back to Costello. You tell him Harlem isn't for sale. You tell him the next man he sends won't get a warning. Then louder for everyone, tell him Bumpy Johnson plays chess while you're all playing checkers." At 11:52 p.m., Vincent the Blade Carbone walked out of Small's Paradise with his useless gun and his shattered reputation. He didn't look at the 78 witnesses who had seen him humiliated. He didn't check on his backup shooters still unconscious in the bathroom. He simply walked into the Harlem night, a broken man. At table 7, Bumpy Johnson sat back down and finished his bourbon. The band started playing again at 11:54 p.m. Conversation resumed, louder now, electric with awe and disbelief. Clara Henderson would tell her grandchildren about this night for the next 40 years. Michael Richardson would write a story his editor would refuse to print, too unbelievable for publication. Ed Small himself poured Bumpy a fresh drink on the house, his hands shaking with relief and respect. The ripple effects hit New York's underworld like an earthquake. By September 21st, Frank Costello held an emergency meeting at the Waldorf Astoria with representatives from all 5 families. The consensus was unanimous: leave Harlem alone. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated something more dangerous than violence had, shown superior intelligence, superior planning, and the ability to infiltrate their operations at will. If he could compromise Carbone's weapon, he could compromise anyone's security. The risk was too high, the profit margin not worth the war. Meyer Lansky, the accountant who ran the numbers, agreed. Harlem would remain independent. On September 25th, Lucky Luciano sent word from Italy, respect Bumpy Johnson's territory. The war ended before it began. Bumpy's position after that night was unassailable. He expanded his territory north to 155th Street and east to 3rd Avenue. His numbers operation grew to $4.2 million annually. More importantly, had proven that black men could outthink, outmaneuver, and outplay the most powerful crime families in America. Harlem remained Harlem, independent, proud, protected. September 19, 1947, marked the moment organized crime recognized intelligence over brute force. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive through luck or firepower. He survived because he understood that real power comes from information, preparation, and the patience to let your enemy walk into traps they built themselves. While other crime bosses relied on body counts and intimidation, Bumpy weaponized knowledge. He turned bartenders into intelligence agents, maids into reconnaissance, and routine maintenance appointments into strategic opportunities. That night at Small's Paradise became legend not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. The most feared hitman in New York couldn't fire a single shot. What this reveals about Bumpy Johnson is the essence of his genius. He wasn't the strongest, the richest, or the most violent man in organized crime. He was the smartest. His philosophy differed fundamentally from contemporaries like Luciano or Costello, who believed power flowed from the barrel of a gun. Bumpy understood that power flows from the mind that decides which gun fires and when. He played a different game entirely, one his enemies couldn't comprehend until they had already lost. Real power isn't about guns or money or territory. Real power is making your enemy's weapon useless before they even think to draw it. The lesson echoes beyond 1947, beyond organized crime, beyond Harlem itself. Intelligence defeats strength. Preparation defeats surprise. Patience defeats aggression. Vincent Carbone walked into Small's Paradise believing he controlled the moment, but Bumpy Johnson had controlled that moment for 18 days before Carbone even knew the game had started. That's the difference between surviving and thriving in a world designed to crush you. If this story showed you why Bumpy Johnson was the smartest man in Harlem, hit subscribe. Drop a like if you respect the 3 moves ahead mindset. Comment below, what would you have said if you were Bumpy at that table? Next week we cover the night Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson faced down the NYPD together, and why the police were the ones who blinked first.